Be no fun if I can help it, Matt muttered. Nelisian had not gotten much sleep? Ha! The whole lot of them had been out enjoying themselves at the festival. Not that he had not enjoyed himself in patches, but only when he could forget he was with a woman who thought he was some sort of bloody doll. What sea folk women? When Nynaeve said I returned last night, she brought a dozen or more, Matt. Eslin blew out his breath, and his hands made swaying motions. The way they moved. Matt shook his head. He was not thinking clearly. Tylen was scrambling his brains. Nynaeve and Elaine had told him about the Windfinders, reluctantly and in sworn secrecy, after trying to hold back even when Nynaeve wanted to go, much less why. And not a single blush at the effort either. Women keep promises in their own way, so the saying went. Come to think of it, Lawton and Belvin were not with the rest of the Red Arms. Maybe Nynaeve thought to make up for the other by keeping them with her now. In their own way. But if she had the Windfinders already in the palace, surely it would not take half a week to use the bowl. Might please not. As if thinking of her had been a summons, Nynaeve came strolling through the screen of plants into the stable yard. Matt's jaw dropped. The tall man in a dark green coat on her arm was Lan. Or rather, she was on his, clinging to it with both hands, smiling up at him. With any other woman, Matt would have said she was moon-eyed and dreaming. But this was Nynaeve. She gave a start once she realized where she was, and took a hasty step to one side, though she still held on to Lan's hand for a moment. Her choice of dresses was no better than Elaine's. All blue silk and green embroidery, cut low enough to show a heavy gold ring that would have rattled on her two thumbs together, dangling into her cleavage on a thin gold chain. The white hat she carried by its ribbons was trimmed with blue plumes, her dust cloak green linen embroidered in blue. She and Elaine made the other women drab by comparison in their woolens. In any case, whether or not she had been calf-eyes a moment before, she was all herself now, shifting her braid around. Join the other men now, Lan, she said peremptorily, and we can go. The last 4 coaches are for the men. As you say, Lan replied, bowing with a hand on his sword hilt. She watched him stride toward Matt with an expression of wonder, probably unable to believe he was obeying so meekly, then gave herself a shake and recovered her bristly self again. Gathering up Elaine and the other women, she herded them toward the first 2 coaches like a woman shooing geese. By the way she shouted for someone to open the stable yard gates, no one would have known she had been the one delaying their departure. She shouted at the drivers, too, setting them to snatching up their reins and flourishing their long whips. It was a marvel they waited for anyone to climb aboard. Scrambling awkwardly after Lan and Nelisian and Veslin into the 3rd coach, Matt propped his spear across the door and sat down hard with the basket on his lap as the coach lurched forward. Where did you come from, Lan? He burst out as soon as introductions were out of the way. You're the last man I expected to see. Where have you been? I thought you were dead. I know Rand's afraid you are. And letting Nynaeve order you around? Why in the light would you do that? The stone-faced warder seemed to consider which question to answer. Nynaeve and I were married last night by the mistress of the ships, he said finally. The Athaan Mier have several unusual marriage customs. There were surprises for both of us. A small smile touched his mouth, if nothing else. He shrugged slightly. Seemingly, that was all the answer he intended to give. The blessing of the light be upon you and your bride, Veslin murmured politely, with as much of a bow as the confines of the coach would allow, and Elysian mumbled something, though it was plain from his expression that he thought Lan must be mad. Elysian had had a good bit of Nynaeve's company. Matt just sat there, swaying with the coach's motion and staring. Nynaeve? Married? Lan? Married to Nynaeve? The man was mad. No wonder his eyes looked so bleak. Matt would as soon have stuffed a rabid fox down his own shirt. Only a fool married, and only a madman would marry Nynaeve. If Lan noticed that not everyone was overjoyed, he gave no sign. Except for his eyes, he looked no different than Matt remembered. Maybe a little harder, if that was possible. "There is something more important," Lan said. "Nynaeve doesn't want you to know, Matt, but you need to hear it. Your 2 men are dead, killed by Moghedien. I'm sorry, but if it is any consolation, they truly were dead before they knew. Nynaeve thinks Moghedien must be gone, or she'd have tried again, but I am not so certain. It seems she has a personal enmity toward Nynaeve, although Nynaeve managed to avoid telling me why." Again the smile. Lan seemed unaware of it. "Not all of it, at least. And it does not matter. Best you know what might be facing us beyond the river, though." "Moghedien," Veslin breathed, eyes shining. The man was probably seeing fun. "Moghedien," Elysian breathed, but in his case, it was more of a groan, and he gave his pointed beard a fitful jerk. "Those bloody flaming women," Matt muttered. "I hope you don't include my wife," Lan said coldly, one hand gripping the hilt of his sword, and Matt quickly raised his own hands. "Of course not. Just Elaine and the kin." After a moment, Lan nodded, and Matt breathed a small sigh of relief. It will be just like Nynaeve to get him killed by her husband. Her husband? When sure as bread was brown, she would have hidden the fact that one of the Forsaken might be in the city. Even Moghedien did not really frighten him, not so long as he had the fox head around his neck. But the medallion could not protect Elysian or any of the rest. No doubt Nynaeve thought she and Elaine would do that. They let him bring along the red arms, all the while laughing up their sleeves at him while they... "Aren't you going to read my mother's note, Matt?" Until Veslin mentioned it, he had not realized there was a sheet of paper, folded small, tucked in between the basket and the striped cloth. Just enough showed to reveal the green seal impressed with the anchor and sword. He broke the wax with his thumb and unfolded the page, holding it so Veslin could not see what was written. As well he did. But then again, considering how the other man saw things, maybe it did not matter. Either way, Matt was just as glad no eyes but his saw those words. His heart sank deeper by the line. "Matt, my sweet, I'm having your things moved to my apartments. So much more convenient. By the time you return, Rosella will be in your old rooms to look after young Oliver. He seems to enjoy her company. I have seamstresses coming to measure you. I will enjoy watching that. You must wear shorter coats. And new breeches, of course. You have a delightful bottom. Duckling, who is this daughter of the 9 moons I made you think of? I have thought of several delicious ways to make you tell me." Silent. The others were all looking at him expectantly. Well, Lan was simply looking, but his gaze was more unnerving than the rest. That stare seemed almost dead. "The Queen thinks I need new clothes," Matt said, stuffing the note into his coat pocket. "I think I'll take a nap." He pulled the brim of his hat down over his eyes, but he did not close them, staring out the window, where the tied-back curtain let in occasional eddies of dust. It also let in the wind, though, which was considerably better than the heat of a closed coach. Moghedien and Tylen. Of the two, he would rather confront Moghedien. He touched the fox head hanging in the open neck of his shirt. At least he had some protection against Moghedien. Against Tylen, he had no more than he did against the daughter of the bloody 9 moons, whoever she was. Unless he could find some way to make Nynaeve and Elaine leave Abu Dar before tonight, everybody was going to know. Sullenly, he tugged his hat lower. These flaming women really were making him act like a girl. In another minute, he was afraid, he might just start crying. Chapter 38. 6 Stories. Matt would have gotten out and pulled the coach himself if he could. He thought they might have moved faster. The streets were already full, with the sun not all the way up. Wagons and carts wending their way noisily through the crowds and wind-blown dust, to shouts and curses both from drivers and those forced to get out of the way. So many barges slid along the canals and the bargemen's poles that a man almost could have walked the canals like streets, stepping from one barge to the next. A noisy hum hung over the gleaming white city. Abu Dar seemed to be trying to make up for time lost yesterday, not to mention at High Chazaline, and the Feast of Lights, and well it might, considering that tomorrow night was the Feast of Embers, with Madden's Day celebrating the founder of Altara 2 days after that, and the Feast of the Half Moon the following night. Southerners had a reputation for industry, but he thought it was because they had to work so hard to make up for all the festivals and feast days. The wonder was that they had the strength for it. Eventually, the coaches did reach the river, drawing up at one of the long stone landings that jutted out into the water, all lined with steps for boarding the boats tied alongside. Sticking a wedge of dark yellow cheese and a butt end of bread into his pocket, he stuffed the basket well under the seat. He was hungry, but someone in the kitchens had been in too much of a hurry. Most of the basket was filled with a clay pot full of oysters, but the kitchens had forgotten to cook them. Scrambling down behind Lan, he left Melesian and Beslan to help Bannon and the others down from the last coaches. Nearly a dozen men, and not even the Karianan really small, they had been jammed in like apples in a barrel and clambered out stiffly. Matt strode ahead of the warder toward the lead coach, the Ashandarai slanted across his shoulder. Nynaeve and Elaine were both going to get a piece of his mind, no matter who was listening. Trying to keep Moghedien hidden, not to mention 2 of his men dead. He was going to... Suddenly very conscious of Lan towering behind him like a stone statue with that sword on his hip, he amended his thoughts. The daughter heir, at least, was going to hear about keeping that sort of secret. Nynaeve was standing on the landing, tying on her blue-plumed hat and talking back up into the coach when he reached it. "We'll work out, of course, but who would think the sea folk of all people would demand such a thing? Even just in private." "But Nynaeve," Elaine said as she stepped down with her green-plumed hat in her hand, "if last night was as glorious as you say, how can you complain about—" That was when they became aware of him and Lan. Of Lan, really. Nynaeve's eyes opened wider and wider, filling her face as it reddened to shame 2 sunsets. Maybe 3. Elaine froze with one foot still on the coach step, giving the warder such a frown you would have thought he had sneaked up on them. Lan gazed down at Nynaeve, though, with no more expression than a fence post, and for all Nynaeve appeared ready to crawl under the coach and hide, she stared up at Lan as if no one else existed in the world. Realizing her frown was wasted there, Elaine took her foot off the step and moved out of the way of Rihanna and the 2 wise women who had shared the coach, to Marla and a graying Saldaean woman named Janira. But the daughter heir did not give up. Oh no, she transferred that scowl to Matt Coffin, and if it altered a whit, it was to deepen. He snorted and shook his head.
"Hope you're doing well."
Usually when a woman was in the wrong, she could find so many things to blame on the nearest man that he wound up thinking maybe he really was at fault. In his experience, old memories or new,
"How you been doing?"
There were only 2 times a woman admitted she was wrong. When she wanted something, and when it snowed at midsummer. Nynaeve seized at her braid, but not as if her heart was in it. Her fingers fumbled and fell away, and she started wringing her hands instead. "Lan," she began unsteadily, "you mustn't think I would talk about—" The warder cut in smoothly, bowing and offering her his arm. "We are in public, Nynaeve. Whatever you say in public, you may. May I escort you to the boat?" "Yes," she said, nodding so vigorously that her hat nearly fell off. She straightened it hurriedly with both hands. "Yes, in public. You will escort me." Taking his arm, she regained some measure of composure, at least insofar as her face went. Gathering her dust cloak in her free hand, she practically dragged him across the quay toward the landing. Matt wondered whether she might be ill. He rather enjoyed seeing Nynaeve drop to peg or 6, but she hardly ever let it last 2 breaths. Aes Sedai could not heal themselves. Maybe he should suggest to Elaine that she deal with whatever was wrong with Nynaeve. He avoided healing like death or marriage himself, but it was different for other people as he saw it. First, though, he had a few choice words to say about secrets. Opening his mouth, he raised an admonitory finger. And Elaine poked him in the chest with hers, her scowl beneath that plumed hat so cold it made his toes hurt. Mistress Corley, she said in the icy voice of a queen pronouncing judgment, explain to Nynaeve and me the significance of those red flowers on the basket, which I see at least you have shame enough to have hidden. His face went redder than Nynaeve's had thought of. A few paces away, Rihanna Corley and the other two were tying on hats and adjusting dresses the way women did every time they stood up, sat down, or moved 3 steps. Yet, despite giving their attention to their clothes, they had enough left over for glances in his direction, and for once they were neither disapproving nor startled. He had not known the bloody flowers meant anything. 10 sunsets would not have done for his face. So, Elaine's voice was low for his ears alone, but it dripped disgust and contempt. She gave her cloak a twitch to keep it from touching him. It's true. I could not believe it of you, not even you. I'm sure Nynaeve couldn't. Any promise I made to you is abolished. I would not keep any promise to a man who could force his attentions on a woman, on any woman, but especially on a queen who has offered him me, force my attentions on her, he shouted. Or rather, he tried to shout. Choking made it come out in a wheeze. Seizing Elaine's shoulders, he pulled her away from the carriages a little distance. Shirtless dockmen in stained green leather vests hurried by, carrying sacks on their shoulders or rolling barrels along the quay, some pushing low barrows loaded with crates, all giving the coaches a wide berth. The Queen of Altara might not have much power, but her sigil on a coach door ensured that commoners would give it room. Nelisian and Veslin were chatting as they led the Red Arms onto the landing, Bannon bringing up the rear and staring gloomily at the choppy river. He claimed to have a tender belly when it came to boats. The wise women from both coaches had gathered around Rihanna, watching, but they were not close enough to overhear. He whispered hoarsely just the same. You listen to me. That woman won't take no for an answer. I say no and she laughs at me. She's starved me, bullied me, chased me down like a stag. She has more hands than any 6 women I ever met. She threatened to have the serving women undress me if I didn't let her. Abruptly, what he was saying hit him, and who he was saying it to. He managed to close his mouth before he swallowed a fly. He became very interested in one of the dark metal ravens inlaid in the haft of the Ashandarai, so he would not have to meet her eyes. What I mean to say is, you don't understand, he muttered. You have it all backwards. He risked a glance at her under the edge of his hat brim. A faint blush crept into her cheeks, but her face became solemn as a marble bust. It appears that I may have misunderstood, she said soberly. That is very bad of Thailand. He thought her lips twitched. Have you considered practicing different smiles in a mirror, Matt? Startled, he blinked. What? I have heard reliably that is what young women do who attract the eyes of kings. Something cracked the sobriety of her voice, and this time her lips definitely twitched. You might try patting your eyelashes, too. Catching her lower lip under her teeth, she turned away, shoulders shaking, dust cloak streaming behind her as she hurried toward the landing. Before she darted beyond hearing, he heard her chortle something about a taste of his own medicine. Brianna and the wise women scurried in her wake, a flock of hens following a chick, instead of the other way around. The few bare-chested boatmen up on their boats stopped coiling lines, or whatever they were doing, and bowed their heads respectfully as the procession went by. Snatching off his hat, Matt considered throwing it down and jumping on it. Women! He should have known better than to expect sympathy. He would like to throttle the bloody daughter heir, and Nynaeve, too, on general principle. Except, of course, that he could not. He had made promises, and those dice were still using his skull for a dice cup, and one of the Forsaken might be around somewhere. Settling the hat squarely back on his head, he marched down the landing, brushed past the wise woman, and caught up to Elaine. She was still trying to fight down giggles, but every time she cut her eyes his way, the color in her cheeks renewed itself, and so did the giggles. He stared straight ahead. Bloody women. Bloody promises. Moving his hat long enough to pull the leather cord from around his neck, he reluctantly shoved it in her direction. The silver fox head dangled beneath his fist. You and Nynaeve will have to decide which of you wears this. but I want it back when we leave Abu Dar. You understand? The moment we leave... Suddenly he realized he was walking alone. Turning, he found Elaine standing stock still 2 paces back, staring at him with Rihanna and the rest clustered behind her. "What's the matter now?" he demanded. "Oh, yes, I know all about Maggedian." A skinny fellow with red stones on his brass hoop earrings, bending over a mooring line, jerked around so fast at that name that he pitched over the side with a loud yell and a louder splash. Matt did not care who heard. "Trying to keep her secret, and 2 of my men dead, after you promised... Well, we'll talk about that later. I made a promise, too. I promised to keep the pair of you alive. Maggedian shows up, she'll go after you 2. Now here." He pushed the medallion at her again. She shook her head slowly in puzzlement, then turned to murmur to Rihanna. Only after the older women were on their way toward where Nynaeve stood beckoning them, at the head of a flight of boat stairs, did Elaine take the fox head, turning it over in her fingers.
Set up real quick too.
"Do you have any notion what I would have done to have this for study?" she said quietly. "Any notion at all?" She was tall for a woman, but she still had to look up at him. She might never have seen him before. "You are a troublesome man, Matt Cawthon. Lenny would say I was repeating myself, but you..." Expelling her breath, Elaine reached up to pull his hat off and slipped the cord over his head. She actually tucked the fox head into his shirt and patted it before handing him his hat. "I won't wear that while Nynaeve still doesn't have one, or Avienda. And I think they feel the same. You wear it. After all, you can hardly keep your promise if Maggedian kills you. Not that I think she's still here. I think she believes she killed Nynaeve, and I would not be surprised if that was all she came for. You must be careful, though. Nynaeve says there's a storm coming, and she doesn't mean this wind. That faint blush returned to her cheeks. I am sorry I laughed at you. She cleared her throat, looking away. Sometimes I forget my duty to my subjects. You are a worthy subject, Matron Cawthon. I will see that Nynaeve understands the right of you and Thailand. Perhaps we can help. No, he spluttered. I mean, yes. I mean, that is... Oh, kiss a flaming goat if I know what I mean. I almost wish you didn't know the truth. Nynaeve and Elaine sitting down to discuss him with Thailand over tea. Would he ever live that down? Would he ever again look any of them in the eye afterward? But if they did not, he was between the wolf and the bear with nowhere to run. Oh, sheep swallop! Sheep swallop and bloody buttered onions! He nearly wished she would call him down for his language the way Nynaeve would, just to change the subject. Her lips moved silently, and for an instant he had the strange impression that she was repeating what he had just said. Of course not. He was seeing things, that was all. Aloud, she said, I understand, sounding just as if she did. Come along now, Matt. We can't waste time standing in one spot. Gaping, he watched her lift skirts and cloak to make her way along the landing. She understood. She understood, and not one acid little comment, not one cutting remark. And he was her subject, her worthy subject. Fingering the medallion, he followed. He had been sure the fight would be to ever get it back. If he lived as long as 2 Aes Sedai, he still would never understand women, and noble women were purely the worst. When he reached the steps Elaine had gone down, the boat's 2 brass-earringed oarsmen were already using their long sweeps to push the vessel away. Elaine was herding Rihanna and the last of the wise women into the cabin, and Lan stood up in the bows with Nynaeve. A shout from Veslin called him onto the next boat, which held all of the men except the warder. Nynaeve said there wasn't any room for any of us, Elysian said as the boat rocked its way out into the Elder. She said we'd crowd them. Veslin laughed, looking around their own boat. Vannon sat beside the cabin door with his eyes closed, trying to pretend he was somewhere else. Arnon and Tad Candle, and Endoran, despite being as dark as either of the boatmen, had climbed atop the cabin. The rest of the Red Arms hunkered about the deck, trying to keep out of the way of the rowers. Nobody went into the cabin, all apparently waiting to see whether Matt and Elysian and Veslin wanted it. Matt put himself beside the tall bow post, peering after the other boat, crawling on its sweeps just ahead. The wind whipped the dark, choppy waters, and his scarf as well, and he had to hold on to his hat. What was Nynaeve up to? The other 9 women on the second boat were all in the cabin, leaving the deck to her and Lan. They stood up in the bows, Lan with his arms folded, Nynaeve gesturing as though explaining. Except that Nynaeve seldom explained anything. Better say never than seldom. Whatever she was doing, it did not last long. There were whitecaps out in the bay, where seafolk rakers and skimmers and soarers heaved at their anchors. The river was not so bad, but the boat still wallowed more than Matt remembered from any previous trip. Before long, Nynaeve was draped over the railing, losing her breakfast while Lan held her. That reminded Matt of his own belly. Tucking his hat under his arm so it could not blow away, he pulled out the wedge of cheese. "Veslin, is this storm likely to break before we come back from the Rahad?" He took a bite of the sharp-tasting cheese. They had 50 different sorts in Abu Dar, all good. Nynaeve was still hanging over the side. How much had the woman eaten this morning? "I don't know where we'll shelter if we're caught." He could not think of a single inn he had seen in the Rahad that he would take the women into. "No storm," Veslin said, seating himself on the railing. "These are the winter trade winds. The trades come twice a year, in late winter and late summer. But they have to blow much harder before it comes to storm." He directed a sour look out toward the bay. "Every year those winds brought ships from Tarabang and Daradaman. I wonder whether they ever will again." "The wheel weaves," Matt began, and choked on a crumb of cheese. Blood and ashes, he was starting to sound like some gray hair resting his aching joints in front of the fireplace. Worrying about taking the women into a rough inn. A year ago, half a year, he would have taken them and laughed when their eyes popped, laughed at every prim snip. "Well, maybe we'll find you some fun in the Rahad anyway. At the least, somebody will try to cut a purse or pull Elaine's necklace off." Maybe that was what he needed to clean the taste of sobriety from his tongue. Sobriety. Light. What a word to apply to Matt Cawthon. Something must be scaring him more than he thought if he was shriveling up this way. Maybe he needed some of Veslin's sort of fun. That was crazy. He had never seen the fight he would not rather walk around. But maybe... Veslin shook his head. "If anyone can find it, you can, but you'll be with 7 wise women, Matt. 7. With just 1 at your side, you could slap a man, even in the Rahad, and he would swallow his tongue and walk away. And the women. What's the fun of kissing a woman without the risk she'll decide to stick a knife in you?" "Burn my soul," Elysian muttered into his beard. "It sounds as though I've dragged myself from bed for a dull morning." Veslin nodded in commiseration. "If we're lucky, though, the Civil Guard does send patrols to the Rahad occasionally, and if they're after smugglers, they dress like anyone else. They seem to think nobody will notice a dozen or so men together carrying swords, whatever they wear. And they're always surprised when the smugglers ambush them, which is what nearly always happens. If Matt's Taviran luck works for us, we might be taken for the Civil Guard, and some smugglers might attack us before they see the red belts." Elysian brightened and began rubbing his hands together. Matt glared at them. Maybe Veslin's sort of fun was not what he needed. For one thing, he had more than enough of women with knives. Nynaeve still hung over the side of the boat ahead. That would teach her to gorge herself. Wolfing down the last of the cheese, he began on the bread and tried to ignore the dice in his head. An easy trip with no trouble did not sound bad at all. A quick trip with a quick departure from Abu Dar. The Rahad was everything he remembered, and everything Veslin feared. The wind made climbing the cracked gray stone steps at the boat landing into a perilous feat, and after that it grew worse. Canals ran everywhere, just as across the river, but here the bridges were plain, the grimy stone parapets broken and crumbling. Half the canals were so silted that boys waded waist deep in them, and hardly a barge was to be seen. Tall buildings stood crowded together, blocky structures with scabrous once-white plaster gone in huge patches to reveal rotting red brick, bordering narrow streets with broken paving stones. In those streets where even the fragments had not been ripped up. Morning did not really reach into the shadows of the buildings. Dingy laundry hung drying from every third window, except where a structure stood empty. Some did, and those windows gaped like eye sockets in a skull. A sour, sweet smell of decay permeated the air, last month's chamber pots and ancient refuse moldering wherever it had been flung, and for every fly on the other side of the Eldar, 100 buzzed here in clouds of green and blue. He spotted the peeling blue door of the Golden Crown of Heaven, and shuddered at the thought of taking the women in there if the storm broke, despite what Beslan said. Then he shuddered again for having shuddered. Something was happening to him, and he did not like it. Nynaeve and Elaine insisted on taking the lead, with Rihanna between them and the wise women close behind. Lan stayed at Nynaeve's shoulder like a wolfhound, hand on sword hilt, eyes constantly searching, radiating menace. In truth, he was probably enough protection for 24 pretty 16-year-olds carrying sacks of gold, even here. But Matt insisted that Bannon and the rest keep their eyes open. In fact, the former horse thief and poacher kept so close to Elaine that anyone could have been forgiven for thinking he was her warder, if a rather fat and rumpled one. Beslan rolled his eyes expressively at Matt's instructions, and Elysian irritably stroked his beard and muttered that he could still be in bed. Men strutted arrogantly along the streets, with often ragged vests and no shirts, wearing great brass hoops in their ears and brass finger rings set with colored glass. One knife or sometimes two stuck behind their belts. Hands hovering near those knives, they stared as though daring someone to give the wrong twist to a look.
I'll be right back.
Others skulked from corner to corner, doorway to doorway with hooded eyes, imitating the slat-ribbed dogs that sometimes snarled from a dark alleyway, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze into. Those men hunched over their knives, and there was no way to tell which would run and which stab. By and large, the women made any of the men appear humble, parading in worn dresses and twice as much brass jewelry as the men. They carried knives too, of course, and their bold, dark eyes sent 10 sorts of challenge in every glance. In short, the Rahad was the sort of place where anyone wearing silk could hardly hope to walk 10 steps without being cracked over the head, after which they had best hope to wake stripped to the skin and tossed onto a pile of rubbish in an alley, since the alternative was not to wake at all. But children darted from every second door with chipped pottery cups of water sent by their mothers in case the wise women wished to drink. Men with scarred faces and murder etched into their eyes stared open-mouthed at 7 wise women together, then bobbed jerky bows and inquired politely if they could be of assistance. Was there anything that required carrying? Women, sometimes with as many scars and always eyes to make Tylan flinch, curtsied awkwardly and breathlessly asked whether they might supply directions. Had anyone made a bother of themselves to bring so many wise women? If so, the strong implication was, Tamala and the rest had no need of troubling themselves if they would just supply the name. Oh, they glared at the soldiers as hotly as ever, though even the hardest flinched away from Lan after a single look, and oddly enough from Bannon. A few of the men growled at Beslan and Elysian whenever they gazed too long at a woman's deep neckline. Some growled at Matt, though he could not understand why. Unlike those two, he was never in danger of his eyeballs falling down the front of a woman's dress. He knew how to look discreetly. Nynaeve and Elaine were ignored for all their finery, and so was Rihanna in her red wool dress. They did not have the red belt, but they did have the protection of those belts. Matt realized that Beslan had been right. He could empty his purse on the ground, and no one would pick up a copper, at least so long as the wise women remained. He could pinch the bottom of every woman in sight, and even if she had apoplexy, she would walk away. What a pleasant walk, Elysian said dryly, with such interesting sights and smells.
Distract yourself on the road.
Did I tell you I didn't get much sleep last night, Matt? Do you want to die in bed? Matt grumbled. They might as well all have stayed in bed. They were bloody useless here, that was for sure. The tyrant snorted indignantly. Beslan laughed, but he probably thought Matt meant something else. Across the Rahad they marched until Rihanna finally stopped in front of a building exactly like every other, all flaking plaster and crumbling brick, the same Matt had followed another woman to yesterday. No laundry hung from these windows, only rats lived in there. In here, she said. Elaine's eyes climbed slowly to the flat roof. 6, she murmured in tones of great satisfaction. 6, Nynaeve sighed, and Elaine patted her arm as though sympathizing with her. I wasn't really sure, she said. So Nynaeve smiled and patted her. Matt did not understand a word of it. So the building had 6 floors. Women behaved very strangely sometimes. Well, most of the time. Inside, a long hallway carpeted with dust ran dimly to the back, the far end lost in shadows. Few of the doorways held doors, and those were rough planks. One opening, almost a third of the way down the hall, led to a narrow flight of steep stone-faced steps, climbing upward. That was the way he had gone the day before, following footprints in the dust, but he thought some of those other openings must be crossing corridors. He had not taken time to look around then, but the building was too deep and too wide for this floor to be served by only the one they saw. It was too big for only one way in. Really, Matt, Nynaeve said, when he told off Harnan and half the Red Arms to find any way back in and guard it. Lan kept so close to her side he might have been glued there. Don't you see by now there's no need? Her tone was so mild that Elaine must have passed on the truth about Thailand, but if anything, that only soured his mood further. He did not want anyone to know. Bloody useless. But those dice were still rattling around in his head. Maybe Mogedion likes back doors, he said dryly. Something chittered in the dark end of the hall, and one of the men with Harnan cursed loudly about rats. You told him, Nynaeve breathed furiously at Lan, one hand snapping shut on her braid. Elaine made an exasperated sound. This is no time to stop for an argument, Nynaeve. The bowl is upstairs. The bowl of the winds. A small ball of light suddenly appeared, floating in front of her, and without waiting to see whether or not Nynaeve was coming, she gathered her skirts and darted up the stairs. Vannon dashed after her with a startling turn of speed for his bulk, followed by Rihanna and most of the wise women. Round-faced Sumeko and Diana, tall and dark and pretty despite the lines at the corners of her eyes, hesitated, then remained with Nynaeve. Matt would have gone too, if Nynaeve and Lan had not been in his way. Would you let me by, Nynaeve? He asked. He deserved to be there at least, when this fabulous bloody bull was uncovered. Nynaeve? She was so focused on Lan she seemed to have forgotten anyone else. Matt exchanged glances with Beslin, who grinned and squatted easily, with Korovin and the remaining Red Arms. Elysian leaned against the wall and yawned ostentatiously, which was a mistake with all that dust about. The yawn turned into a coughing fit that darkened his face and doubled him over. Even that did not distract Nynaeve. Carefully, she took her hand away from her braid. I am not angry, Lan, she said. Yes, you are, he replied calmly, but he had to be told. Nynaeve, Matt said. Lan? Neither one of them so much as flickered an eye his way. I would have told him when I was ready, Landman Dragoran. Her mouth clamped shut, but her lips writhed as though she were talking to herself. I will not be angry with you, she went on in a much milder tone, and that sounded addressed to herself as well. Very deliberately, she tossed her braid back over her shoulder, jerked that blue-plumed hat straight, and clasped her hands at her waist. If you say so, Lan said mildly. Nynaeve quivered. Don't you take that tone with me, she shouted. I tell you I'm not angry. Do you hear me? Blood and ashes, Nynaeve, Matt growled. He doesn't think you're angry. I don't think you're angry. A good thing women had taught him to lie with a straight face. Now can we go upstairs and fetch this bloody bowl of the winds? A marvelous idea, said a woman's voice from the door to the street. Shall we go up together and surprise Elaine? Matt had never seen the two women who walked into the hall before, but their faces were Aes Sedai faces. The speaker's was long and cold as her voice, her companions, framed by scores of thin dark braids, worked with colored beads. Nearly 24 men crowded in behind them, bulky fellows with heavy shoulders, clubs and knives in hand. Matt shifted his grip on the Ashandari. He knew trouble when he saw it, and the fox head on its chest was cool, almost cold against his skin. Somebody was holding the one power. The two wise women nearly fell over, dropping curtsies as soon as they saw those ageless faces, but Nynaeve certainly knew trouble too. Her mouth worked soundlessly as the pair came down the hallway, her face all consternation and self-recrimination. Behind him, Matt heard a sword leaving its scabbard, but he was not about to look back to see whose. Lan just stood there, which meant, of course, that he looked like a leopard ready to pounce. "They're Black Aja," Nynaeve said at last. Her voice started faint and gained strength as she went on. "Thalian Boda and Isban Shafar. They committed murder in the tower, and worse since. They're dark friends and—" Her voice faltered for an instant. "They have shielded me." The newcomers continued to advance serenely. "Have you ever heard such nonsense, Isban?" the long-faced Aes Sedai asked her companion, who stopped grimacing at the dust long enough to smirk at Nynaeve. "Isban and I come from the White Tower, while Nynaeve and her friends are rebels against the Amaranseat. They'll be punished severely for that, and so will anyone who helps them." With a shock, Matt realized the woman did not know. She thought that he and Lan and the others were just hired strong-arms. Thalian directed a smile at Nynaeve. It made a blizzard warm by comparison. "There's someone who will be overjoyed to see you when we take you back, Nynaeve. She thinks you are dead. Better the rest of you go now. You don't want to meddle in Aes Sedai affairs. My men will see you to the river." Without taking her eyes from Nynaeve, Thalian motioned for the men behind her to come forward. Lan moved. He did not draw his sword, and against Aes Sedai, he should have had no chance if he had. No chance in any case. But one moment he was standing still, and the next he had thrown himself at the pair. Just before he struck, he grunted as though hit hard, but he crashed into them, carrying both Black Sisters to the dusty floor. That opened the sluice gates wide. Lan pushed himself to hands and knees, shaking his head groggily, and one of the bulky fellows raised an iron-strapped club to smash his skull. Matt stabbed the fellow in the belly with his spear, as Beslan and Elysian and the 5 Red Arms rushed to meet the Dark Friend's shouting charge. Lan staggered to his feet, sword sweeping out to open a Dark Friend from crotch to neck. There was not much room to work sword or Ashandari in the corridor, but the tight quarters were what allowed them to face odds of 2-to-1 or worse without being overcome in the first moment. Grunting men struggled with them face to face, elbowing each other for room to stab or swing a club at them. Small spaces remained clear around the Black Sisters and around Nynaeve. They saw to that themselves. A wiry Andran Red Arm almost bumped into Thalian, but at the last instant, he jerked into the air and flew across the hallway, knocking down 2 of the heavy-shouldered Dark Friends in his flight before smacking into the wall and sliding down, the back of his head leaving a bloody smear on the cracked, dusty plaster. A bald-headed Dark Friend squeezed through the line of defenders and rushed at Nynaeve with outstretched knife. He yelled as his feet were suddenly jerked back from him, a yell that cut off when his face hit the floor so hard that his head bounced. Obviously, Nynaeve was no longer shielded, and if the chilly silver fox head sliding around Matt's chest as he fought was not enough indication that she and the Black Sisters were in some sort of struggle, the way they glared at her and she at them, ignoring the battle around them, shouted the fact. The 2 wise women looked on in horror. They had their curved knives in their fists, but they huddled against the wall, staring from Nynaeve to the other 2 with eyes wide and mouths hanging open. "Fight!" Nynaeve snapped at them. She turned her head just a fraction, so she could see them as well as Thalian and Isban. "I cannot do it alone. They're linked. If you don't fight them, they will kill you. You know about them now." The wise woman gaped at her, as though she had suggested spitting in the queen's face. In the midst of shouts and grunts, Isban laughed melodiously. In the midst of shouts and grunts, a shrill scream echoed down the stairs. Nynaeve's head swung that way. Suddenly she staggered, and her head swung back like a wounded badger's, with a scowl that should have made Thalian and Isban leave right then if they had any sense. Nynaeve spared an agonized glance for Matt, though. "There was channeling upstairs," she said through her teeth. "There's trouble." Matt hesitated. More likely Elaine had seen a rat. More likely... He managed to knock aside a dagger thrust at his ribs, but there was no room to stab back with the Ashendari or use the haft like a quarterstaff. Veslin stabbed past him and took his attacker through the heart. "Please, Matt," Nynaeve said tightly. She never begged. She would cut her own throat first. "Please." With a curse, Matt pulled himself out of the fight and dashed up the steep, narrow stairs, taking all 6 flights in the dark stairwell at a dead run. There was not a single window to give light. If it was just a rat, he was going to shake Elaine till her teeth. He burst out onto the top floor, not much brighter than the stairwell, with only one window at the street end, burst into a scene from Nightmare. Women lay sprawled everywhere. Elaine was one, half on her back against the wall, eyes closed. Bannon crouched on his knees, blood streaming from nose and ears, feebly trying to pull himself up against the wall. The last woman on her feet, Janira, fled toward Matt as soon as she saw him. He had thought of her as a hawk, with her hooked beak of a nose and sharp cheekbones, but her face was pure terror now, those dark eyes wide and stark. "Help me!" she screamed at him, and a man caught her from behind. He was an ordinary-looking fellow, maybe a little older than Matt, of the same height and slender in a plain gray coat. Smiling, he took Janira's head between his hands and twisted sharply.
No time to...
The sound of her neck breaking was like a dry branch snapping. He let her drop in a boneless heap and gazed down at her. For a moment, his smile looked rapturous. By the light of a pair of lanterns, a small knot of men just beyond Bannon were prying open a door to the squeal of rusted hinges. Matt hardly noticed. His eyes went from Janira's crumpled corpse to Elaine. He had promised to keep her safe for Rand. He had promised. With a cry, he launched himself at the killer, Ashendari extended. Matt had seen Myrddraal move, but this fellow was quicker, hard as that was to believe. He just seemed to flow from in front of the spear, and seizing a haft, he pivoted, flinging Matt past him 5 paces down the hall. Breath left when he hit the floor in a small cloud of dust. So did the Ashendari. Struggling for air, he pushed himself up, Hawk's head dangling from his open shirt. Dragging a knife from under his coat, he flung himself at the man again, just as Nelisian appeared at the head of the stairs, sword in hand. Now they had him. However quick the man made a Myrddraal seem stiff. He slid around Nelisian's thrust as though there was not a bone in his body, right hand shooting out to seize Nelisian's throat. His hand came away with a liquid, ripping sound. Blood fountained past Nelisian's beard. His sword dropped, ringing on the dusty stone floor, and he clutched both hands to his ruined neck, red running through his fingers as he fell. Matt crashed into the killer's back, and they all 3 hit the floor together. He had no compunctions about stabbing a man in the back when it was necessary, especially a man who could tear somebody's throat out. He should have let Nelisian stay in bed. The thought came sadly as he drove the blade home hard, then a second time, a third. The man twisted in his grip. Possible, but somehow the fellow rolled over beneath him, pulling the knife hilt out of his hand. Elysian's staring eyes and bloody throat were a reminder right before his eyes. Desperately, he grabbed the man's wrists, one hand slipping a little in the blood that ran down the fellow's hand. The man smiled at him. With a knife sticking out of his side, he smiled. "He wants you dead as much as he wants her," he said softly. And as if Matt was not holding him at all, his hands moved toward Matt's head, driving Matt's arms back. Matt pushed frantically, threw all of his weight against the fellow's arms to no avail. Light, he might as well have been a child fighting a grown man. The fellow was making a game of it, taking his bloody time. Hands touched his head. Where was his flaming luck? He gave a heave with what seemed his last strength, and the medallion fell against the man's cheek. The man screamed. Smoke rose around the edges of the fox head, and a sizzle like bacon frying. Convulsively, he hurled Matt away with hands and feet both. This time, Matt flew 10 paces and slid. When he scrambled to his feet, half dazed, the man was already up, hands trembling at his face. A raw red brand marked where the fox head had fallen. Gingerly, Matt fingered the medallion. It was cool. Not the cool of someone channeling nearby. Maybe they were still at it below, but that was too far off. Just the cool of silver. He had no notion what this fellow was, except that he certainly was not human. But between that burn and 3 stab wounds, with the knife hilt still jutting out beneath his arm, he had to be slowed enough for Matt to get past him to the stairs. Avenging Elaine was all very well, and Elysian too, but it was not going to happen today, apparently, and there was no call to supply a reason for avenging Matt Cawthon. Jerking the knife out of his side, the man hurled it at him. Matt snagged it out of the air without thinking. Tom had taught him to juggle, and Tom said he had the quickest hand he'd ever seen. He went around so he held it properly. The point slanted up. He noticed the gleaming blade, and his heart sank. No blood. There should have at least been a smear of red, but the steel shone bright and clean. Maybe even 3 stab wounds was not going to slow this, whatever he was. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The other men were streaming out of that door they had pried open, the door those footprints had led him to yesterday. But their arms seemed full of rubbish, small half-rotted chests, a cask with cloth-wrapped objects bulging through missing staves, even a broken chair and a cracked mirror. They must have had orders to take everything. Paying no attention whatever to Matt, they hurried toward the far end of the hall and vanished around a corner. There had to be another set of stairs back there. Maybe he could follow them at a distance. Maybe... Just before the doorway they had come out of, Bannon made another effort to stand and fell back. Matt bit back a curse. Lugging Bannon was going to slow him, but if his luck was in... It did not say Elaine, but maybe... From the corner of his eye, he saw her move, lifting a hand to her head. The man in the gray coat saw it too. With a smile, he turned toward her. Sighing, Matt tucked the useless knife into its scabbard. "You can't have her," he said loudly. "Promises." One jerk broke the leather cord around his neck. The silver fox head dangled a foot below his fist. It made a low hum as he whirled it in a double loop. "You can't bloody have her!" He started forward, keeping the medallion spinning. The first step was the hardest, but he had a promise to keep. The fellow's smile faded. Watching the flashing fox head warily, he backed away on his toes. The same light that glittered on the whirling silver from the single window made a halo around him. If Matt could drive him that far, maybe he could see whether a 6th-story drop would do what a knife could not. Brand livid on his face, the fellow backed away, sometimes half-reaching as if to try grabbing past the medallion. And suddenly, he darted to one side, into one of the rooms. This one had a door that he pulled shut behind him. Matt heard the bar drop. Maybe he should have left it there, but without thinking, he raised a foot and slammed the heel of his boot against the center of the door. Dust leaped off the rough wood. A second kick, and rotten bar catches gave way, along with a rusted hinge. The door fell in, hanging at a slanted angle. The room was not entirely dark. A little light reached it from the window at the end of the hall, just one door away, and a broken triangle of mirror leaning against the far wall spread a faint illumination. That mirror let him see everything without going in. Aside from that and a piece of a chair, there was nothing else to see. The only openings were the doorway and a rat hole beside the mirror. The man in the gray coat was gone. "Matt," Elaine called faintly. He hurried away from the room as much as toward her. There was shouting somewhere below, but Nynaeve and the rest would have to take care of themselves for the moment. Elaine was sitting up, working her jaw and wincing, when he knelt beside her. Dust covered her dress, her hat hung askew, some of the plumes broken, and her red-gold hair looked as if she had been dragged by it. "He hit me so hard," she said painfully. "I don't think anything's broken, but..." Her eyes latched onto his, and if he had ever thought she looked at him as if he were a stranger, he saw it for true now. "I saw what you did, Matt. With him. We might as well have been chickens in a box with a weasel. Channeling wouldn't touch him. The flows melted the way they do with your..." Glancing at the medallion still hanging from his fist, she drew a breath that did interesting things to that oval cutout. "Thank you, Matt. I apologize for everything I ever did or thought." She sounded as though she really meant it. "I keep building up tow toward you," she smiled ruefully.
Getting
but
there.
I am not going to let you beat me. You are going to have to let me save you at least once to balance matters. I'll see what I can arrange, he said dryly, stuffing the medallion into a coat pocket. Toe? Beat her? Light. The woman was definitely spending too much time with Avienda. Once he helped her to her feet, she looked at the hallway, at Bannon with his blood-smeared face, and the women lying where they had fallen, and she grimaced. Oh, light, she breathed. Oh, blood and bloody flaming ashes. Despite the situation, he gave a start. It was not just that he had never expected to hear those words out of her mouth. They seemed peculiar, as if she knew the sounds but not the meanings. Somehow, they made her sound younger than she looked. Shaking off his arm, she discarded her hat, just tossing it aside, and hurried to kneel beside the nearest wise woman, Rihanna, and take her head in both hands. The woman lay limp, face down, and arms stretched out as though she had been tripped up running. Toward the room everyone had been after, toward her attacker. Away. This one is beyond me, Elaine muttered. Where's Nynaeve? Why didn't you come up with me? Nynaeve! She shouted toward the stairs. No need to shriek like a cat, Nynaeve growled, appearing on the stairs. She was looking back over her shoulder down the stairs, though. You hold her tight, you hear me? She shrieked like a cat. She carried her hat and shook it at whoever she was shouting at. You let her get away, too, and I'll box your ears till you hear bells next year. She turned then, and her eyes nearly bulged out of her head. A light shine on us, she breathed, hurrying to bend over Janira. One touch, and she straightened, wincing painfully. He could have told her the woman was dead. Nynaeve seemed to take death personally. Giving herself a shake, she went on to the next. To Marla, and this time it appeared there was something she could heal. It also appeared to Marla's injuries were not simple because she knelt over her, frowning. What happened here, Matt? She demanded without looking around at him. Her tone made him sigh. He might have known she would decide it was his fault. Well, Matt, what happened? Will you speak up, man, or do I have to? He never learned what threat she intended to offer. Lan had followed Nynaeve out of the stairwell, of course, with Sumeko right at his heels. The stout wise woman took one look at the hall and immediately lifted her skirts and ran to Rihanna. She did give Elaine one worried glance before lowering herself to her knees and beginning to move her hands over Rihanna in an odd way. That was what pulled Nynaeve up short. What are you doing? She said sharply. Not halting what she was doing to Tamarla, she spared the round-faced woman only short glances, but they were as piercing as her voice. Where did you learn that? Sumeko gave a start, but her hands did not stop. Forgive me, Aes Sedai, she said in a breathless, disjointed rush. I know I'm not supposed to. She'll die if I don't. I know I wasn't supposed to keep trying to. I just wanted to learn, Aes Sedai. Please. No, go on, Nynaeve said absently. Most of her attention was fixed on the woman under her hands, but not all. You seem to know a few things even I. That is to say, you have a very interesting way with the flows. I suspect you'll find that a great many sisters want to learn from you. Half under her breath, she added, maybe now they'll leave me alone. Sumeko could not have heard that last, but what she did hear dropped her chin to her considerable chest. Her hands barely paused, though. Elaine, Nynaeve went on, would you look for the bowl, please? I suspect that door is the one.
Yeah.
She nodded to the correct door, standing open like half a dozen others. That made Matt blink until he saw two tiny cloth-wrapped bundles lying in front of it where the looters must have dropped them. Yes, Elaine muttered. Yes, I can do that much at least. Half raising a hand toward Bannon, still on his knees, she let it fall with a sigh and strode through the doorway, which almost immediately emitted a cloud of dust and the sound of coughing. The more than plump wise woman had not been the only one following Nynaeve and Lan. Iaina stalked out of the stairwell, forcing the Terrabonner dark friend in front of her by means of an arm twisted up into her back and a fist clutching the back of her neck. Iaina's jaw was set, her mouth tight. Her face was half frightened certainty that she would be skinned alive for manhandling an Aes Sedai, and half determination to hold on no matter what. Nynaeve had that effect on people sometimes. The Black Sister was wide-eyed with terror, sagging so she surely would have fallen except for Yaina's grip. She must have been shielded, certainly, and with equal surety, she probably would have chosen being skinned to whatever was going to happen to her. Tears began leaking from her eyes, and her mouth sagged in silent sobs. Behind them came Veslin, who gave a sad sigh at the sight of Nelisian, and a sadder for the women, and then Harnan and 3 of the Red Arms, Fergan, Gordoran, and Metwin. 3 who had been at the front of the building. Harnan and 2 of the others had bloody gashes in their coats, but Nynaeve must have healed them below. They did not move as if they still had injuries. They looked very subdued, though. "What happened at the back?" Matt asked quietly. "Burn me if I know," Harnan replied. "We walked right into a knot of shoulder thumpers with knives in the dark. There was one, moved like a snake." He shrugged, touching the blood-stained hole in his coat absent-mindedly. "One of them got a knife into me, and the next I remember is opening my eyes with Nynaeve Sedai bending over me. And Mendare and the others dead as yesterday's mutton." Matt nodded. "One who moved like a snake, and got out of rooms like one, too." He looked around the hallway. Brianna and Tamara were on their feet, straightening their dresses, of course, and Bannon peering into the room where Elaine was apparently trying out some more curses, seemingly with no more success than earlier. It was hard to tell because of the coughing. Nynaeve stood, helping up Sibella, a scrawny yellow-haired woman, and Sameko was still working on Femella, with her pale honey hair and big brown eyes. But he was never going to admire Melora's bosom again. Brianna knelt to straighten her limbs and close her eyes, while Tamara performed the same service for Janira. 2 wise women dead, and 6 of his Red Arms. Killed by a man the power would not touch. "I found it!" Elaine shouted excitedly. She strode back out into the hall, holding a wide, round bundle of rotted cloth she would not let Bannon take from her. Coated in gray from head to toe, she looked as if she had lain down and rolled in the dust. "We have the Bowl of the Winds, Nynaeve." "In that case," Matt announced, "we are bloody well getting out of here now." Nobody argued. Oh, Nynaeve and Elaine insisted on all the men making sacks out of their jackets for things they rooted out of the room. They even loaded the wise women down, and themselves. And Rihanna had to go down and recruit men to carry their dead down the boat landing. But nobody argued. He doubted if the Rahat had ever seen as odd a procession had made its way to the river,
I got my dad
or one that moved more quickly.
That should work.
Chapter 39. Promises to Keep. "We are bloody well getting out of here now," Matt said again later. This time there was argument. There had been argument for the past half hour, near enough. Outside, the sun was past its noon peak. The trade winds cut the heat a little. Stiff yellow curtains fastened over the tall windows bulged and snapped at gusts. 3 hours back in the Tarasan Palace, the dice still bouncing in his head, and he wanted to kick something, or somebody. He tugged at the scarf tied around his neck. It felt as though the rope that had given him the scar under that scarf was back and tightening slowly. Love of the light, are you all blind? Or just deaf? The room Tylan had provided was large, with green walls and high blue ceiling, and no furnishings but gilded chairs and small tables set with pearl shell. Yet it was crowded even so. It seemed so anyway. Tylan herself sat before one of the 3 marble fireplaces with her knees crossed, watching him with those dark eagle's eyes and a small smile, idly kicking her layered blue and yellow petticoats, idly toying with the jeweled hilt of her curved knife. He suspected Elaine or Nynaeve had spoken to her. They were there too, seated to either side of the queen, somehow in clean dresses and apparently even bathed, though they had only been out of his sight for minutes at a stretch since returning to the palace. They almost matched Tylan for regal dignity in their bright silks. He was not sure who they wanted to impress with all that lace and elaborate embroidery. They looked ready for a royal ball, not a journey. He himself was still in his muck, with his dusty green coat hanging open, and the silver fox head caught in the neck of his half-undone shirt. Knotting the leather cord had shortened it, but he wanted the medallion touching his skin. He was around women who could channel, after all. Truth, those three women could probably have crowded the room by themselves. Tylen could have done it by herself, so far as he was concerned. If Nynaeve or Elaine had spoken to her, it was a very good thing that he was going. They three could have done it alone, but... "This is preposterous," Marililla announced. "I've never heard of any shadow spawn called a golem. Have any of you?" That was directed to Adelius and Pandine, Saritha and Cariana. Facing Tylen, the cool-eyed Aes Sedai serenity of all five made a fair job of turning their high-backed armchairs into thrones. He could not understand why Nynaeve and Elaine just sat like lumps, coolly serene too, but absolutely silent. They knew, they understood, and for some reason Marililla and that lot slathered their tongues with meekness for them now. Matt Cawthon, on the other hand, was a hairy-eared lout who needed to be kicked, and from Marililla on down, they were all ready to do the kicking. "I saw the thing," he snapped. "Elaine saw the thing. Rihanna and the wise women saw it. Ask any of them." Gathered at the end of the room, Rihanna and the five surviving wise women shrank back like huddling hens, afraid of actual questions. All but Sumeko, anyway. Thumbs tucked behind her long red belt, the round woman kept frowning at the Aes Sedai, then shaking her head, frowning, and shaking her head. Nynaeve had a considerable talk with her in the privacy of the cabin on the boat coming back, and Matt thought that had something to do with her newfound attitude. He had caught mention of Aes Sedai more than once, not that he had been trying to eavesdrop. The rest seemed to be wondering whether they should offer to fetch tea. Only Sumeko had even appeared to consider the offer of a chair. Sabella, flapping bony arms in shock, had nearly fainted. "No one denies the word of Elaine Aes Sedai, Master Cawthon," said Rhaenyra Din Kalon Bluestar in a cool, deep voice. Even had the dignified woman in silks to match the red and yellow floor tiles not been named to him earlier, the old memories meshed into his own would have identified her as windfinder to the mistress of the ships by the 10 fat gold rings in her earlobes, those in each ear connected by a golden chain, half hidden by the narrow wings of white in her straight black hair. The medallions clustered along the finer chain that ran to her nose ring would tell him what clan she came from, among other things. So would the tattoos in her slim dark hands. "What we question is the danger," she continued. "We do not like leaving the water without good cause." Nearly 20 seafolk women stood gathered behind her chair, rocking colorful silks and earrings and medallions on chains for the most part. The first odd thing he had noticed about them was their attitude toward the Aes Sedai. They were perfectly respectful, on the surface at any rate, but he had never before seen anyone look at Aes Sedai smugly. The second odd thing came from those other men's memories. He did not know a great deal about the seafolk from them, but enough. Every Atha Anmier, man or woman, began as the lowest deckhand, whether they were destined one day to become the master of the blades or the mistress of the ships herself. And every step of the way between, the seafolk were sticklers for rank, to make any king or Aes Sedai look a sloven. The women behind Rhaenyra were a peculiar lot by any measure. Windfinders to wave mistresses rubbing shoulders with windfinders from sorors, by their medallions. But two wore bright blouses of plain wool above the dark oily breeches of deckhands, each with a single thin ring in her left ear. A second and third ring in the right indicated they were being trained as windfinders, but with two more to earn, not to mention the nose ring, it would be a long while yet that either would find herself called to haul sail whenever the deckmaster needed her, and find the deckmaster's flail across her rump if she did not move quickly enough. Those two did not belong in this gathering by any memory he had. Normally, the windfinder to the mistress of ships would not even have spoken to him. "Very much as I said, Rhaenyra," Marililla said, icily condescending. She had certainly noticed those smug glances. That tone did not change as she shifted her attention to him. "Do not grow petulant, Master Cawthon. We are willing to listen to reason, if you have any." Matt gathered patience. He hoped he could find enough. Maybe if he used both hands and both feet. "Golem were created in the middle of the War of the Power, during the Age of Legends," he began from the beginning. almost from the beginning of what Brigitte had told him. He turned, facing each group of women as he spoke, burning if he was going to let one bunch think they were more important, or that he was bloody pleading with them, especially since he was. They were made to assassinate Aes Sedai. No other reason. To kill people who could channel. The one power won't help you. The power won't touch a golem. In fact, they can sense the ability to channel if they're within, say, 50 paces of you. They can feel the power in you, too. You won't know the golem until it's too late. They look just like anybody else. On the outside. Inside, golem have no bones. They can squeeze themselves under a door. And they're strong enough to rip a door off steel hinges with one hand. Or rip out a throat. Like he should have let Melusine stay in bed. Suppressing a shiver, he pressed on. The women, all of them, watched him, almost not appearing to blink. He would not let them see him shiver. There were only 6 golem made, 3 male and 3 female. At least, that's what they look like. Apparently, even the Forsaken were a little uneasy about them, or maybe they just decided 6 was enough. Either way, we know one is in Abu Dar, probably kept alive since the breaking, in a stasis box. We don't know if any others were put into that box, but one is more than enough. Whoever sent him, and it had to be one of the Forsaken, knew to follow us across the river. He had to have been sent after the Bowl of the Winds, and by what he said to me, to kill Nynaeve or Elaine, maybe both. He spared them a quick look, soothing and sympathetic. Nobody could feel easy knowing that thing was after them. In return, he received a puzzled frown from Elaine, just the smallest wrinkling of her forehead, and from Nynaeve a slight wave of the hand, an impatient wave, to get on with it. To continue, he said, shooting the pair of them a glare. It was very hard not to sigh, dealing with women. Whoever sent the golem has to know the bowl is here in the Tarasin Palace now. If he or she sends the golem here, some of you are going to die. Maybe a lot of you. I can't protect all of you at once. Maybe he'll get the bowl, too. And that's on top of Felian Boda. Small chance she's alone, even with Ispan a prisoner, so that means we have the Black Ajah to worry about as well. Just in case the Forsaken and the golem aren't enough for you. Rihanna and the wise women drew themselves up even more indignantly than Marililla and her friends at the mention of the Black Ajah, and the Aes Sedai, stiffening and gathering skirts, looked ready to stalk out in a huff. Press on. That was all we could do. Now do you see why you all have to leave the palace and take the bowl somewhere the golem doesn't know about? Somewhere the Black Ajah doesn't know? Do you see why it has to be done now? Renyla's sniff would have startled geese in the next room. You merely repeat yourself, Master Cawthon. Marililla Sedai says she has never heard of this golem. Elaine Sedai says there was a strange man, a creature, but little else. What is this stasis box? You have not explained that. How do you know what you claim to know? Why should we go any further from the water than we are, on the word of a man who creates fables from air? Matt looked to Nynaeve and Elaine, though with little hope. If they would only open their mouths, this could have been finished long since, but they gazed back at him, practicing expressionless Aes Sedai masks, till their jaws must be creaking. He could not understand their silence. A bare-bones account of events in the Rahad had been all they gave, and he was willing to bet they would not have mentioned the Black Ajah at all had there been any other way to explain showing up in the palace with an Aes Sedai bound and shielded. Ispan was being held in another part of the palace, her presence known only to a handful. Nynaeve had forced some concoction down her throat, a foul-smelling mix of herbs that bulged the woman's eyes going down and had her giggling and stumbling in short order, and the rest of the knitting circle occupied the room with her for guards. Unwilling guards, but very assiduous. Nynaeve had made it extremely clear that should they let Ispan get away, they had best start running before she laid hands on them again. He very carefully did not look toward Brigitte, standing beside the door with Avienda. The Aiel woman wore an Ebudari dress, not the plain wool she had returned in, but a silver-gray silk riding dress that jarred with her plain-sheathed, one-handled belt knife. Brigida had been quick to shed her own dress for her usual short coat and wide trousers, these dark blue and dark green. A quiver already hung at her hip. She was the source of everything he knew about Golem, and stasis boxes, except what his eyes had seen in the Rahad. And he would not have revealed that on a hot grill. "I read a book once that talked about," he began, and Renila cut him off. "A book," she sneered. "I will not abandon the salt for a book Aes Sedai do not know." Suddenly it struck Matt that he was the only man present. Lan had gone off at Nynaeve's command, gone as tamely as Beslan had at his mother's. Tom and Julian were packing to leave, had probably finished packing by now. If there was any use to it, if they ever did leave. The only man, surrounded by a wall of women who apparently intended to let him beat his head against that wall till his brains were scrambled. It made no sense. None. They looked at him, waiting. Nynaeve, in yellow-slashed, lace-trimmed blue, had pulled her braid over her shoulder so it hung down between her breasts. But that heavy gold ring, Lan's ring, he had learned, was carefully positioned to show anyway. Her face was smooth, and her hands rested in her lap, yet sometimes her fingers twitched. Elaine, in green Ebudari silk that made Nynaeve seem covered up despite the smoky lace collar under her chin, gazed back at him with eyes like cool pools of deep blue water. Her hands lay in her lap, too, but now and again she would begin to trace the thread of gold embroidery that covered her skirts, then immediately stop. Why did they not say something? Were they trying to get back at him? Was it just a case of, Matt wants to be in charge so much, let him see how well he can do without us? He might have believed it of Nynaeve, any time but this anyway, but not of Elaine, not anymore. So why? Rihanna and the wise women did not huddle away from him as they did from the Aes Sedai, but their manner toward him had changed. Tamarla gave him a decently respectful nod. Honey-haired Femella went so far as a friendly smile. Strangely, Rihanna blushed, a pale stain. But they did not count as opposition, really. The 6 women had not said a dozen unprompted words between them since entering this room. Everyone would jump if Nynaeve or Elaine snapped her fingers, keep jumping until told to stop. He turned to the rest of the Aes Sedai. Faces infinitely calm, infinitely patient. Except... Marililla's eyes flickered past him toward Nynaeve and Elaine for one instant. Saritha began slowly smoothing her skirts under his gaze, seemingly unaware of doing so. A dark suspicion bloomed in his mind. Hands moving on skirts, Rihanna's blush, Brigida's ready quiver. A murky suspicion. He did not really know of what, just that he had been going about this the wrong way. He gave Nynaeve a stern look and Elaine a sterner.
Be right back.
Butter would not have melted on their bloody tongues. Slowly, he walked toward the sea folk. He just walked, but he heard someone with Marililla sniff, and Saritha muttered, "Such insolence." Well, he was about to show them insolence. If Nynaeve and Elaine did not like it, they should have taken him into their confidence. Right, but he hated being used, especially when he did not know how or why. Stopping in front of Renila's chair, he studied the dark faces of the Atha-Anmir women behind it before looking down to her. She frowned, stroking a knife set with moonstones thrust behind her sash. She was a handsome woman rather than pretty, somewhere in her middle years, and under different circumstances, he might have enjoyed looking at her eyes. They were large black pools a man could spend an evening just gazing into. Under different circumstances. Somehow the sea folk were the fly in the cream pitcher, and he had not a clue how to pluck it out. He managed to keep his irritation under control, barely. What to bloody do? "You can all channel, I understand," he said quietly, "but that doesn't mean much to me. As well be straight from the start. You can ask Adelias or Vandine how much I care whether a woman can channel." Renila looked past him toward Tylan, but it was not to the queen she spoke. "Nynaeve Sedai," she said dryly, I believe there was no mention in your bargain of my having to listen to this young oakum picker. I don't bloody care about your bargains with anybody else, you daughter of the sands, Matt snapped. So his irritation was not that well under control. A man could only take so much. Gasps rose among the women behind her. Something over 1,000 years ago, a seafolk woman had called an Esseninian soldier a son of the sands just before trying to plant a blade in his ribs. The memory lay tucked inside Matt Cawthon's head now. It was not the worst insult among the Atha'anier, but it came close. Renata's face gorged with blood. Hissing, eyes bulging in fury, she leaped to her feet, that moonstone-studded dagger flashing in her fist. Matt snatched it out of her hand before the blade could reach his chest and shoved her back into her chair. He did have quick hands. He could still hold on to his temper, too. No matter how many women thought they could dance him for a puppet, he could... You listen to me, you bilge stone. All right, maybe you could not hold it. Nynaeve and Elaine need you, or I'd leave you for the golem to crack your bones and the Black Ajah to pick over what's left. Well, as far as you're concerned, I'm the master of the blades, and my blades are bare. What that meant exactly, he had no idea, except for having once heard, when the blades are bare, even the mistress of the ships bows to the master of the blades. This is the bargain between you and me. You go where Nynaeve and Elaine want, and in return, I won't tie the lot of you across horses like pack saddles and haul you there. That was no way to go on. Not with the windfinder to the mistress of the ships. Not with a bilge boy off a broken-backed darter. Renata quivered with the effort of not going for him with her bare hands. Never mind her dagger in his hand. It is agreed, under the light, she growled. Her eyes nearly started out of her head. Her mouth worked, confusion and disbelief suddenly chasing one another across her face. This time, the gasps sounded as if the wind had ripped the curtains down. It is agreed, Matt said quickly, and touching fingers to his lips, he pressed them to hers. After a moment, she did the same, fingers trembling against his mouth. He held out the dagger, and she stared dully at it before taking it from him. The blade went back into its jeweled sheath. It was not polite to kill someone you had sealed the bargain with. At least, not until the terms were fulfilled. Murmurs began among the women behind her chair, rising, and Renila stirred herself to clap her hands once. That silenced windfinders to wave mistresses as quickly as the two deckhands in training. I think I have just made a bargain with a Taviran, she said in that cool, deep voice. The woman could teach Aes Sedai how to pull themselves together quickly. But one day, Master Cawthon, if it pleases the light, I think you will walk a rope for me. He did not know what that meant, except that she made it sound unpleasant. He made his best leg. All things are possible if it pleases the light, he murmured. Courtesy paid, after all. But her smile was disturbingly hopeful. When he turned back to the rest of the room, you would have thought he had horns and wings for the stairs. Is there any further argument? He asked in a wry tone, and did not wait for answers. I thought not. In that case, I suggest you pick out some spot well away from here. We can be on our way as soon as you bundle up your belongings. They made a show of discussion. Elaine mentioned Camelin, sounding at least half serious, and Cariana suggested several remote villages in the Black Hills, all easily reached by gateway. Light anywhere was easily reached by gateway. Van Deen spoke of Arafel, and Avienda suggested Roidian in the Yayu Waste, with the seafolk women growing glummer the farther from the sea were the places named. All a show. To Matt, at least, that was clear by Nynaeve's impatient fiddling with her braid, despite the suggestions coming hot and fast. If I may speak, Aes Sedai, Rihanna said timidly at last. She even raised her hand. The kin maintain a farm on the other side of the river, a few miles north. Everyone knows it is a retreat for women who need contemplation and quiet, but no one connects it to us. The buildings are large and quite comfortable, if there's any need to stay long. And, yes, Nynaeve broke in. Yes, I think that sounds just the thing. What do you say, Elaine? I think it sounds wonderful, Nynaeve. I know Renila will appreciate staying close to the sea. The other 5 sisters practically piled on top of her, saying how agreeable it sounded, how superior to any other suggestion. Matt rolled his eyes to the heavens. Tylen was a study in not seeing what lay under her nose, but Ranila snapped at it like a trout taking a lacewing. Which was the point, of course. For some reason, she was not to know that Nynaeve and Elaine had everything arranged beforehand. She led the rest of the Seafolk women out to gather whatever belongings they had brought, before Nynaeve and Elaine could change their minds. Those 2 would have followed Marililla and the other Aes Sedai, but he crooked a finger at them. They exchanged glances. He would have had to talk an hour to say as much as passed in those looks. Then, somewhat to his surprise, came to him. Avienda and Brigitte watched from the door, Tylen from her chair. "I am very sorry to have used you," Elaine said before he could get a word out. Her smile flashed that dimple at him. "We did have reasons, Matt. You must believe that." "Which you do not need to know," Nynaeve put in firmly, flipping her braid back over her shoulder with a practiced toss of her head that made the gold ring bounce on her bosom. "Lan must be insane. I must say, I never expected you to do what you did. Whatever in the world made you think of trying to bully them? You could have ruined everything." "What's life if you don't take a chance now and then?" he said blithely. As well by him as they thought it was planned instead of temper. But they had used him again without telling him, and he wanted a bit more than that. "Next time you have to make a bargain with the Seafolk, let me make it for you. Maybe that way it won't turn out as badly as the last one." Spots of color blooming in Nynaeve's cheeks told him he had hit the mark squarely. Not bad shooting, blindfolded. Elaine, though, just murmured, "A most observant subject," in tones of rueful amusement. Being in her good books might turn out less comfortable than being in her bad. They swept toward the door without letting him say more. Well, not that he thought they would explain anything. Both were Aes Sedai to the bone. A man learned to live with what he had to. Tylen had all but slipped from his mind, but he had not from hers. She caught him up before he took 2 steps. Nynaeve and Elaine paused at the door with Avienda and Brigitte watching. So they saw when Tylen pinched his bottom. Some things nobody could learn to live with. Elaine put on a face of commiseration, Nynaeve of glowering disapproval. Avienda fought laughter, none too successfully, while Brigitte wore her grin openly. They all bloody knew. "Nynaeve thinks you're a little boy needing protection," Tylen breathed up at him. "I know you're a grown man." Her smoky chuckle made that the dirtiest comment he had ever heard. The 4 women by the door got to watch his face turn beet red. "I will miss you, Pigeon. What you did with Ranila was magnificent. I do so admire masterful men." "I'll miss you too," he muttered. To his shock, that was simple truth. He was leaving Abu Dar just in time. "But if we meet again, I'll do the chasing." She chortled at him, and those dark eagle's eyes almost glowed. "I admire masterful men, Duckling, but not when they try being masterful with me." Seizing his ears, she pulled his head down where she could kiss him. He never saw Nynaeve and the others go, and he walked out on unsteady legs, tucking his shirt back in. He had returned to fetch his spear from the corner and his hat. The woman had no shame, not a scrap of it. He found Tom and Julian coming out of Tylen's apartments, followed by Nerim and Lopen, Elysian's stout man, who each lugged a large wicker pannier made for a pack saddle. Loaded with his belongings, he realized. Julian carried Matt's unstrung bow and had his quiver slung on one shoulder. Well, she had said she was moving in. "I found this on your pillow," Tom said, tossing him the ring he had bought what seemed a year ago. "A parting gift, it seems." There were lover's knots and some other flowers strewn over both pillows. Matt jammed the ring onto his finger. "It's mine, burn you. I paid for it myself." The old gleeman knuckled his mustaches and coughed in a failed effort to stifle a sudden wide grin. Julian snatched off that ridiculous Tarabunner hat and became engrossed in studying the inside of it. Blood and flaming. Matt drew a deep breath. I hope you two spared a moment for your own belongings, he said levelly, because as soon as I grab Oliver, we're on our way, even if we happen to leave a moldy harp or a rusty sword breaker behind. Julian tugged at the corner of his eye with one finger, whatever that was supposed to mean, but Tom actually frowned. Insults to Tom's flute or his harp were insults to himself. My lord, Lopin said mournfully. He was a dark, balding man, rounder than Sumeko, and his black tyrant commoner's coat, tight to the waist, then flaring, like Julian's, fit very tightly indeed. Normally almost as solemn as Nerim, now he had reddened eyes, as though he had been weeping. My lord, is there any chance I might remain to see Lord Nelisian buried? He was a good master. Matt hated saying no. Anybody left behind might be left for a long time, Lopin, he said gently. Listen, I'll need someone to help look after Oliver. Nerim has his hands full with me. For that matter, Nerim will go back to Talmanis, you know. If you'd like, I will take you on myself. He had grown used to having a manservant, and these were hard times for a man hunting work. I would like that very much, my lord, the fellow said lugubriously. Young Oliver reminds me much of my youngest sister's son. Only when they entered Matt's former rooms, the Lady Rosella was there, much more decently clothed than when he had last seen her, and quite alone. Why should I have kept him tied to me, she said, that truly marvelous bosom heaving with emotion as she planted her fists on her hips. The Queen's duckling, it seemed, was not supposed to take a snappish tone with the Queen's attendants. Clip a boy's wings too far, and he will never grow to a proper man. He read his pages aloud, sitting on my knee. He might have read all day, had I allowed it. And did his numbers, so I let him go. Why are you in such a bother? He promised to return by sunset. And he seems to set a great store by his promises. Propping the Ashandarai in its old corner, Matt told the other men to drop their burdens and go find Bannon and the remaining Red Arms. Then he left Rosella's spectacular bosom and ran all the way to the rooms Nynaeve and the other women shared. They were all there, in the sitting room, and so was Lan, with his warder's cloak already draped down his back and saddlebags on his shoulders. His saddlebags, and Nynaeve's, it seemed. A good many bundles of dresses and not-so-small chests stood about the floor. Matt wondered if they would make Lan carry those, too. Of course you have to go find him, Matt Coffin, Nynaeve said. Do you think we would just abandon the child? To hear her, you would have thought that was exactly what he had intended. Suddenly, he was deluged with offers of help, not just Nynaeve and Elaine proposing to put off going to the farm, but Lan and Brigitte and Avienda offering to join the search. Lan was stone cold about it, grim as ever, but Brigitte and Avienda... My heart would break if anything happened to that boy, Brigitte said, and Avienda added, just as warmly, I have always said you do not care for him properly. Matt ground his teeth. In the streets of the city, Oliver might well elude 8 men until he appeared back at the palace at sunset. He did keep his promises, but small chance he would give up one moment of freedom he did not have to. More eyes would mean a quicker search, especially if all the wise women were brought into it. For the space of 3 heartbeats, he hesitated. He had his own promises to keep, though he was wise enough not to put it that way. The bowl is too important, he told them. That Golem is still out there, and maybe Mogedion, and the Black Hadja for sure. The dice thundered in his head. Avienda would not appreciate being lumped in with Nynaeve and Elaine, but he did not care right then. He addressed Lan and Brigitte. Keep them safe until I can reach you. Keep all of them. Startlingly, Avienda said, We will. I promise. He fingered the hilt of her knife. Apparently, she did not understand that she was one of those to be kept safe. Nynaeve and Elaine did. Nynaeve's sudden glare tried to bore a hole through his skull. He expected her to yank on her braid, but strangely, her hand only fluttered toward it before being put firmly to her side. Elaine contented herself with raising her chin, those big blue eyes frosty. No dimple here. Lan and Brigitte understood too. Nynaeve is my life, Lan said simply, putting a hand on her shoulder. The odd thing was, she suddenly looked very sad, and then just as suddenly, her jaw set as though she was preparing to walk through a stone wall and make a large hole. Brigida gave Elaine a fond look, but it was to Matt she spoke. "I will," she said. "Honor's truth." Matt tugged at his coat uncomfortably. He still was not sure how much he had told her while drunk. Light, but the woman could soak it up like dry sand. Even so, he gave the proper response for a Barashandan lord, accepting her pledge. The honor of blood, the truth of blood. Brigitte nodded, and from the startled looks he received from Nynaeve and Elaine, she still kept his secrets close. Like, if any Aes Sedai ever found out about those memories, he might as well know he had blown the horn as well. Foxhead or no foxhead, they would stretch him out till they dug out every last why and how. As he was turning to go, Nynaeve caught his sleeve. "Remember the storm, Matt. It's going to break soon, I know it. You take care of yourself, Matt Cawthon. Do you hear me? Tylan has directions for the farm when you get back with Oliver." Nodding, he made his escape, the dice in his head like echoes of his running boots. Was it during the search that he was supposed to take care of himself, or while getting the directions from Tylan? Nynaeve and her listening to the wind. Did she think a little rain was going to melt him? Come to think, once they used the Bowl of the Winds, it would rain again. It seemed years since rain last fell. Something tugged at his thoughts, something about the weather and Elaine, which made no sense, but he shrugged it off. One thing at a time, the one thing right now was Oliver. The men were all waiting in the Red Arm's long room near the stables, everyone on their feet except Bannon, who lay sprawled on one of the beds with his fingers laced over his belly. Bannon said a man had to take rest when he could. He swung his boots over and sat up when Matt entered, though. He cared about Oliver as much as the others did. Matt was just afraid the man was going to start teaching him how to steal horses and poach pheasants. 7 sets of eyes focused on Matt intently. "Rosella said Oliver's wearing his red coat," he told them. "He gives them away sometimes, but any urchin you see in a good red coat probably knows where Oliver last was. Everybody goes in a different direction. Make loops out from the Malhara and try to be back after about an hour. Wait till everybody is back before you go out again. That way, if somebody finds him, the rest of us won't still be looking tomorrow. Does everybody understand?" They nodded. Sometimes it amazed him. Lanky Tom, with his white hair and mustaches, who had been a queen's lover once, and more willingly than himself, not to mention more than a lover, if you believed half he said. Square-jawed Harnan with that tattoo on his cheek, and more elsewhere, who had been a soldier all his life. Julian with his bamboo staff and his sword-breaker on his hip, who thought himself as good as any lord, even if the idea of carrying a sword himself still made him uneasy. And Fat Bannon, who made Julian look a bootlicker by comparison. Skinny Fergan and Gordoran, nearly as wide in the shoulders as Perrin, and Metwin, whose pale Carianan face still looked like a boy's despite being years older than Matt. Some of them followed Matt Cawthon because they thought he was lucky, because his luck might keep them alive when the swords were out. And some for reasons he was not really sure of, but they followed. Not even Tom had ever more than protested an order of his. Maybe Ranila had been more than luck. Maybe his being Tuviran did more than dump him in the middle of trouble. Suddenly he felt responsible for these men. It was an uncomfortable feeling. Matt Cawthon and responsibility did not go together. It was unnatural. "Take care of yourselves and look sharp," he said. "You know what's out there. There's a storm coming." Now, why had he said that? "Move! We're wasting light." The wind still blew strongly, sweeping dust across the Mulhollow Square, with its statue of a long queen posing above the fountain. But there was no other sign of a storm. Nareen had been noted for her honesty, but not enough to have been depicted completely bare-chested. The afternoon sun burned high in a sky without a cloud, but people rushed through the square as quickly as they had in the morning cool. That was gone, wind or no, down here on the ground. The paving stones seemed to griddle under his boots. Glaring across the square at the wandering woman, Matt headed toward the river. Oliver had not gone off with the street urchins half as often while they were staying at the inn. He had been too content ogling the serving girls and Satala Anand's daughters. So much for the dice telling him he had to move into the palace. Anything he had done since leaving, anything he wanted to do, he amended, thinking of Tylan and her eyes and her hands. Any of it could have been done just as well from there. Those dice spun now, and he wished they would just go away. He tried to move quickly, dodging impatiently around trundling carts and wagons, cursing at lacquered sedan chairs and coaches that nearly ran him down, eyes darting in search of a red coat close to the ground, but the bustle in the streets slowed him to a meander, which was just as well, in truth. No point dashing by the boy without seeing him. Wishing he had brought Pips out of the palace stables, he frowned at the people streaming past. A man on horseback could have moved no faster in the throng, but up in the saddle he could have seen farther. Then again, asking questions from a saddle would have been awkward. Not many folk actually rode inside the city, and some people had a tendency to shy away from anyone on a horse. Always the same question. The first time he asked was at a bridge just below the Malhara, of a fellow selling honey-baked apples from a tray hanging from a strap around his neck. "Have you seen a boy about so high in a red coat?" Oliver liked sweets. "Boy, my lord," the fellow said, sucking his few remaining teeth. "Seen 1,000 boys. Don't remember no coat, though. Would my lord like one apple or two?" He scooped up 2 with bony fingers and pushed them at Matt. The way they gave under his fingers, they were softer than any baking could account for. "Did my lord hear about the riot?" "No," Matt said sourly, and pushed on. At the other end of the bridge, he stopped a plump woman with a tray of ribbons. Ribbons held no fascination for Oliver, but her red petticoats flashed beneath the skirt sewn up nearly to her left hip, and the cut of her bodice revealed rounded cleavage to equal rosellas. "Have you seen a boy?" He heard about the riot from her, too, and from half the people he asked. That rumor, he suspected, had begun with events at a certain house in Rahad that very morning. A wagon driver with her long whip coiled around her neck even told him the ride had been across the river, once she allowed as how she never noticed boys unless they ran under her mules. A square-faced man who sold honeycomb, incredibly dry-looking honeycomb, said the riot had been down near the light tower at the end of the Bay Road, on the eastern side of the mouth of the bay, which was about as likely a place for riding as the middle of the bay itself. There were always 1,000 rumors in any city if you listened, and he was forced to listen to snatches of all of them, it seemed. One of the most remarkably pretty women he had ever seen, standing outside a tavern, Maylene was a serving girl at the Old Sheep, but her only task seemed to be standing outside to attract customers, which she certainly did, told him there had been a battle that morning in the Cordes Hills west of the city, she thought. Or maybe in the Rano Hills across the bay. Or maybe... Remarkably pretty, Maylin, but not very bright. Oliver might have watched her for hours, so long as she never opened her mouth. But she could not remember seeing any boy in a... What color coat had he said again? He heard about riots and battles. He heard about enough strange things seen in the sky or the hills to populate the Blight. He heard that the Dragon Reborn was about to descend on the city with thousands of men at the channel, that the Aiel were coming, an army of Aes Sedai, an army of white cloaks. Nile was dead, and the children intended to avenge him, but why in Abu Dar was not exactly clear. You might have thought the city would be hip-deep in panic with all the tales floating around, but the fact was, even those who told a tale usually only half believed it. So he heard all sorts of nonsense, but not a word about any boy in a red coat. A few streets from the river, he began hearing thunder, great hollow booms that seemed to roll in from the sea. People looked up curiously at the cloudless sky, scratched their heads, and went on about their business. So did he, questioning every seller of sweets or fruit he saw, and every pretty woman afoot. All to no avail. Reaching the long stone quay that ran the whole length of the riverside of the city, he paused, studying the gray docks stretching out into the river and the ships tied to them. The wind blew strong, heaving vessels at their mooring lines, grinding them against the stone docks despite the bags stuffed with wool hung down between for fenders. Unlike horses, ships did not interest Oliver except as a way to go from here to there, and ships were men's business in Abu Dar, even if the lading they carried often was not. Women on these docks would either be merchants keeping an eye on their goods or hard-armed members of the Cargo Loaders Guild, and there would be no sweet sellers here. About to turn away, he realized almost no one was moving. The docks usually bustled, yet on every ship he could see, crewmen lined the rails and had climbed into the rigging to stare toward the bay. Barrels and crates stood abandoned, while shirtless men and wiry women in green leather vests crowded together at the ends of the docks to peer between the ships, south, toward the Thunder. Down that way, black smoke rose in thick towering columns, slanting sharply north on the wind. Hesitating only a moment, he trotted out along the nearest dock. At first, ships tied to the long fingers of stone to the south blocked his view of anything except the smoke. Because of the way the shoreline lay, though, each dock stuck out farther than the next down. Once he pushed into the murmuring crowd at the end, the broad river made an open path of choppy green water to the wave-tossed bay. At least 24 ships were burning out on the wide expanse of the bay, maybe more, engulfed in flame from end to end. A number of others had already settled, only a bow or stern still above water, and that sliding under. Even as he looked, the bow of a broad two-masted ship flying a large banner of red and blue and gold, the banner of Altara, suddenly flew apart with a roar, a boom like thunder, and fast thickening tendrils of smoke wafted away in the wind as the vessel began settling by the head. Hundreds of vessels were in motion. Every craft in the bay, three-masted seafolk breakers and skimmers and two-masted soarers, coastal ships with their triangular sails, river ships under sail or sweep, some fleeing upriver, most trying to beat out to sea. Scores of other ships swanned into the bay before the wind, great bluff-bowed vessels as tall as any of the rakers, crashing through the rolling waves, throwing aside spray. His breath caught as he suddenly made out square-ribbed sails. "Blood and bloody ashes," he muttered in shock. "It's the flaming Sean-Chan." "Who?" demanded a stern-faced woman crowded next to him. A dark blue woolen dress of fine cut marked her a merchant as much as did the leather folder she carried for her bills of lading, or the guild pin over one breast, a silver quill pen. "It's the Aes Sedai," she announced in tones of conviction. "I know channeling when I see it. The Children of the Light will do for them, just as soon as they arrive. You'll see." A lanky, gray-haired woman in a grimy green vest twisted around to confront her, fingering the wooden hilt of her dagger. "Hold your tongue about Aes Sedai, you flaming penny grubber, or I'll peel you and stuff a white cloak down your bleeding gullet." Matt left them waving their arms and shouting at one another, and pushed clear of the crowd, running from the quay. Already he could see 4 huge creatures circling over the city to the south on great pinions, like those of a bat. Figures clung to the creatures' backs, apparently in some sort of saddles. Another flying creature appeared, and more. Below them, flames suddenly fountained above the rooftops with a roar. People ran now, buffeting Matt as he struggled through the streets. "Over!" he shouted, hoping to be heard above the other shouts from every side and the screams. "Over!" Abruptly, everybody seemed to be heading the other way, battering past him. Stubbornly, he forced on against the tide, and came to a street where what all those folk fled from was made plain. A Sean-Chan column rushed by, 100 or more men in helmets like insects' heads, and armor of overlapping plates, all riding animals like cats the size of horses, but covered in bronze scales rather than fur. Leaning forward in their saddles, blue-stringed lances slanted, they galloped toward the Mulhara without looking to either side. Though gallop was not quite the word for the way those creatures moved. The speed was right, but they flowed. It was time to be gone. Past time. As soon as he found... As the end of the column went by, a flash of red, waist-high, caught his eye among the crowd in the street beyond the intersection. "Over!" He darted across, almost on the heels of the last scaled creature, pushing into the crowd in time to see a wide-eyed woman snatch up a little girl in a red dress and run with the child clutched to her bosom. Wildly, Matt pressed ahead, shouldering people aside when they bumped into him, bumping into more than a few himself. "Over! Over!" Twice more he saw a column of fire rise briefly above the rooftops, and smoke drifted to the sky in a dozen places. Several times he heard those booming roars, much closer than the bay now. Inside the city, he was sure. More than once the ground quivered beneath his boots. And then the street was clearing again, people fleeing in every direction, down alleys and into houses and shops. For Seanchan on horses were coming. Not all were armored men. Near the head of that small thicket of lances rode a dark woman in a blue dress. Matt knew the large red panels on her skirts and bosom were worked with silver lightning. A silver leash, gleaming in the sun, ran from her left wrist to the neck of a woman in gray, a Damani, who trotted beside the Suldam's horse like a pet dog. He had seen more of Seanchan at Falma than he wanted to, but unconsciously he paused at the mouth of an alleyway, watching. The roars and fires had showed that somebody in the city was trying to fight back at least, and now he was going to see such an attempt. The Seanchan were not the only reason everyone else had gotten out of sight. At the other end of the street, a good 100 mounted men swung long-pointed lances down. They wore baggy white breeches and green coats, and the gold cords on the officer's helmet glittered. With a collective shout, 100 or more of Thailand's soldiers hurled themselves toward the city's attackers. They outnumbered the Seanchan in front of them by at least 2 to 1. Bloody fools, Matt muttered. Not like that. That Suldam will... The only movement among the Seanchan was the woman in the lightning-marked dress, raising her hand to point, as one might launch a hawk or send off a hound. The golden-haired woman at the other end of the silvery leash took a small step forward. The fox-head medallion cooled against his chest. Underneath the head of the Ebudari Char, the street suddenly erupted, paving stones and men and horses flying into the air with a deafening roar. The concussion knocked Matt flat on his back, or maybe it was the way the ground seemed to leap from under his feet. He pulled himself up in time to see the front of an inn across the way suddenly collapse into the street in a cloud of dust, exposing the rooms within. Men and horses lay everywhere. Pieces of men and horses, those still alive, thrashing, around a hole in the ground half as wide as the street. Screams from the wounded filled the air. Fewer than half the Ebudari staggered to their feet, dazed and stumbling. Some seized up the reins of horses, as wobbly-legged as they, heaving themselves into saddles, kicking the animals into some semblance of a run. Others just ran afoot, all away from the Seanchan. Steel they could face, but not this. Running, Matt realized, seemed a particularly fine idea right then. A glance back down the alley showed dust and rubble piled at least a story high. He darted down the street ahead of the fleeing Ebudari, keeping as close to the walls as possible, hoping none of the Seanchan would think he was one of Thailand's soldiers. He should never have worn a green coat. The Suldam apparently was not satisfied. The foxhead went cool again, and from behind another roar hammered him to the pavement that jumped up to meet him. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard masonry groan. Above him, the white-plastered brick wall began leaning outward. "What happened to my bloody luck?" he shouted. He had time for that, and just time to realize, as brick and timbers crashed down on him, that the dice in his head had just stopped dead.
Chapter 40. Spears. Mountains rose all around Galina Kasban, little more than large hills behind, but snow-capped peaks ahead, and higher peaks beyond those, yet she really saw none of them. The stones of the slope bruised her bare feet. She panted, lungs laboring already. The sun baked overhead as it had for seemingly endless days, burning the sweat out of her in rivers. Anything other than putting one foot in front of the other seemed beyond her. Strange that with all the sweat coming out of her, she could not find any moisture in her mouth. She had been Aes Sedai fewer than 90 years, her long black hair untouched as yet by gray, but for nearly 20 of those she had been head of the Red Aja, called the highest by other Red Sisters in private, considered by other Reds equal to the Amerlin seat, and for all but 5 of the years she had worn the shawl, she had been of the Black Aja in truth. Not to the exclusion of her duties as a Red, but superior to them. Her place on the Supreme Council of the Black Aja was next to that of Alviarin herself, and she was one of only 3 who knew the name of the woman who led their hooded meetings. She could speak any name in those meetings, a king, and know that name belonged
Hell
to the
yeah.
dead. It had happened
Can't beat
with a
that.
king and with a queen. She had helped to break 2 Amerlins, twice helped turn the most powerful woman in the world into a squealing wretch, eager to tell all she knew, had helped make it seem that one of those had died in her sleep, and had seen the other deposed and stilled. Such things were a duty, like the need to exterminate men with the ability to channel. Not actions she took pleasure in beyond that of tasks well done, but she had enjoyed leading the circle that stilled Swan Sanche. Surely all those things meant that Galina Casban was herself among the mightiest of the world, among the most powerful. Surely they did. They must. Her legs wavered like springs that had lost their tempering, and she fell heavily, unable to catch herself with arms and elbows tightly bound behind her. The once white silk shift, the only garment left to her, tore again as she slid on the loose rocks, scraping her welts. A tree stopped her. Face pressed against the ground, she began to sob. "How?" she moaned in a thick voice. "How can this happen to me?" After a time, she realized that she had not been pulled to her feet. No matter how often she fell, she had never before been allowed a moment's respite. Blinking away tears, she raised her head. Aiel women covered the mountainside, several hundred of them scattered among the barren trees with their spears, the veils they could raise in an instant hanging down their chests. Galina wanted to laugh. Maidens. They called these monstrous women maidens. She wished she could laugh. At least there were no men present, a small mercy. Men made her skin crawl, and if one could see her now, less than half clothed. Anxiously her eyes sought for Tarava, but most of the 70 or so wise ones stood together looking at something farther up the slope, blocking her view. There seemed to be a murmur of voices from the front of them. Maybe the wise ones were conferring about something. Wise ones. They had been brutally efficient in teaching her the correct names, never just Aiel woman, and never wilder. They could smell contempt however she hid it. Of course you did not have to try hiding what had been seared out of you. Most of the wise ones were looking away, but not all. The glow of Saidar surrounded a young, pretty, red-haired woman with a delicate mouth, who watched Galina with large, intent blue eyes. Perhaps as a sign of their own disdain, they had chosen the weakest of their number to shield her this morning. Mikara was not truly weak in the power. None of them were that. But even smarting from shoulders to knees as she was, Galina could have broken Mikara's shield with little effort. A muscle in her cheek spasmed uncontrollably. It always did when she thought of another escape attempt. The first had been bad enough. The second... Shuddering, she fought not to sob again. She would not make the attempt again until she was sure of complete success. Very sure. Absolutely sure. The mass of wise ones parted, turning to follow Terava with their eyes as the hawk-faced woman strode toward Galina. Suddenly panting once more with apprehension, Galina tried to struggle to her feet. Hands bound and muscles watery, she had only reached her knees when Terava bent over her, necklaces of ivory and gold clattering softly. Seizing a handful of Galina's hair, Terava forced her head back sharply. Taller than most men, the woman did that even when they were standing, craning Galina's neck painfully to make her look up into the wise one's face. Terava was somewhat stronger in the power than she, which relatively few women were, but that was not what made Galina tremble. Cold, deep blue eyes stabbed into her own, held her more tightly than Terava's rough hand. They seemed to strip her soul naked, as easily as the wise one handled her. She had not begged yet, not when they made her walk all day with hardly a drop of water, not when they forced her to keep up as they ran for hours, not even when their switches made her howl. Terava's cruel, hard face, staring down at her impassively, made her want to beg. Sometimes she woke at night, stretched out tight between the 4 stakes where they bound her, woke whimpering from dreams that her whole life would be lived under Terava's hands. "She is collapsing already," the wise one said in a voice like stone. "Water her and bring her." Turning away, she adjusted her shawl. Galina Kazban forgotten until there was a need to recall her. To Terava, Galina Kazban was less important than a stray dog. Galina did not try to rise. She had been watered often enough by now. It was the only way they let her drink. Aching for moisture, she did not resist when a blocky maiden took her by the hair as Terava had and pulled her head back. She just opened her mouth as far as she could. Another maiden, with a puckered scar slanting across nose and cheek, tilted a water skin and slowly poured a trickle into Galina's waiting mouth. The water was flat and warm. It was delicious. She swallowed convulsively, awkwardly, holding her jaws wide. Almost as much as water to drink, she wanted to move her face under that thin stream, to let it run over her cheeks and forehead. Instead, she kept her head very steady, so that every drop went down her throat. Spilling water was cause for another beating. They had thrashed her inside of a creek 6 paces wide for spilling a mouthful over her chin. When the water skin was finally taken away, the blocky maiden hauled her to her feet by her bound elbows. Galina groaned. The wise ones were gathering their skirts over their arms, exposing their legs well above soft knee-high boots. They could not be going to run. Not again. Not in these mountains. The wise ones loped forward as easily as if on level ground. An unseen maiden cut Galina across the back of her thighs with a switch, and she stumbled to a semblance of a run, half dragged by the blocky maiden. The switch slashed her legs whenever they faltered. If